Hello there! Welcome to our fun and exciting learning with reading and writing poetry. I am teacher Isabell, together with teacher Arianne, teacher Kristine, and teacher JP. So let's start! Let us define poetry. So what is poetry? Poetry comes from the Greek term making. Specifically, it was seen as a way of communicating with the gods. Poetry pops up in many religious texts, but was most notably used by storytellers and songs in order to remember lines. Poetry is a form of writing that uses not only words but also form, such as patterns of sound, imagery, and figurative language to convey the message. It is a style of writing that uses a formal organization and it is often divided up into lines or stanzas. Additionally, poetry may be written as individual poems or included in other written forms as in dramatic poetry, hymns, or song lyrics. It expresses different feelings such as friendship, love, death, and other human emotions. Why do authors write poetry? Authors write poetry to entertain their readers. They write to express their feelings, thoughts, and emotions. Why is poetry so important? Poetry is so important because it helps us to understand and appreciate the world around us. Knowing that poetry is the highest form of literature, and it has a vital role in our lives because it shows different shades of human beings. In fact, poetry is one of the most ancient arts and also the product of human imagination. Now, let's proceed to the elements of genre. First is the narrative poetry. Narrative poetry tells stories through verse, like a novel or a short story. Narrative poems feature a single speaker, the narrator. Narrative poems contain all of the elements of a fully developed story, including characters, plot, conflict, and resolution. Using a range of poetic techniques such as rhyme and meter, narrative poetry presents a series of events, often including action and dialogue. It uses rhythm and powerful language. There is a beginning, middle, and end. It has a topic sentence that states your opinion. The second element of genre is the dramatic poetry. Dramatic poetry, also known as dramatic verse or verse drama. It is a written work that both tells a story and connects the reader to an audience through emotions or behavior. It expresses the deep emotion of a poet and is quite a popular genre for operas. Dramatic poetry as a literary form remained popular from the classical period through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. There are three forms of dramatic poetry: the dramatic monologue, soliloquy, and character sketch. First is the dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is a combination of drama and poetry. It presents the speech of a single character in a specific situation at a critical moment. The speaker addresses one or more persons who are present and who are listening to the speaker, but remain silent. The speaker's personality and character, his relationship to others, his sense of values and attitudes towards life are indirectly gleaned from his monologue. Second is the soliloquy. It is a passage spoken by a speaker in a poem or a character in a play. Here, no one present to hear the speaker. The thoughts expressed, the emotions displayed, and the revelations made, freely and without inhibition, give deep insights into the character. It is used in poetic dramas to enrich and vivify characterization, inform the audience about other developments in the play. The last form of dramatic poetry is the character sketch. It is a poem in which the writer is concerned less with matters of story, complete or implied, than he is with arousing, sympathy, antagonism, or merely interest for an individual. The poet serves as observer and commentator. It incorporates the element of suspense, conflict, or tension. The last element of genre is the lyric poetry. Lyric poetry refers to a short poem, often with song-like qualities, that expresses the speaker's personal emotions and feelings. The poet may use rhyme, meter, or other literary devices to create a song-like quality, historically intended to be sung and accompany musical instrumentation. Lyric now describe a broad category of a non-narrative poetry including elegy, ode, and sonnets. Some scholars categorize lyric poetry in three subtypes. First is the lyric of vision, lyric of thought, and the lyric of emotion. Next, proceed to the different types of lyric poetry. First is the elegy. An elegy is a very sad poem, often expressing sorrow over someone who has died. Elegy are typically written in couplets that have a specific pattern of meter. The second type of lyric poetry is the ode. An ode is a lyric poem with a complicated structure that praises a person or marks an important event. This is generally meant to be performed with music. The last type of lyrical poetry is sonnet. A sonnet is a very old form of poetry. It contains 14 lines, and each line with 5 iambic feet, or 10 syllables. Shakespeare is a famous poet who wrote sonnets. Essential elements. First is the theme. The theme is an underlying message that the writer or artist wants to convey. Themes can feature in poetry, a short story, a novel, or even a work of art. It can be something as simple as love or something more complex, such as human versus nature. The theme of the story is a broad message about life. It is very important because a story's theme is part of the reason why the author wrote this story. The author has a message he wants to share with readers, and he uses his story as a way to get the message across. Next is the tone. The tone is the poet's attitude toward the poem's speaker, the reader, and the subject matter. When speaking with others, your tone clarifies and conveys the meaning. A phrase as simple as, "I don't know," can be taken in a number of different ways depending on how you decide to express it.
Elements for specific forms. We have here forms of conventional poetry. Let us now define first what is conventional poetry. Conventional poetry uses meter, which is a regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables that forms a beat like in music. It often uses rhyme as well, although blank verse does not and is still considered conventional. We have here 4 forms of conventional poetry. First on the list is haiku. This is an ancient form of Japanese poetry which contains a total of 17 syllables shared between 3 lines. It usually uses a syllabic pattern 5-7-5. To write a haiku, you must understand syllables. Syllable is a part of a word that has one beat or sound. A haiku poem has 3 lines and follows a pattern of syllables. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line has 5 syllables. A haiku poem is free verse. It does not a required rhyme. Let's look at an example. The leaf falls gently, floating down towards the ground, crunching underfoot. The first line, "The leaf falls gently," has 5 syllables. The second line, "floating down towards the ground," has 7 syllables, and the third line, "crunching underfoot," has 5 syllables. Always remember that haiku does not need rhyme. It has 3 lines and follows the syllable pattern 5-7-5. Second form on the list is villanelle. Villanelle is comprised of a fixed verse of 19 lines. It consists of 5 tercets and quatrain, where the 2 lines are considered as a couplet in itself. Villanelles use a specific rhyme scheme of ABA for their tercets and ABAA for the quatrain. The first and third lines of the first tercet function as repeating refrains, which alternate as the final lines of the subsequent tercet and appear again as the 2 final lines of the concluding quatrain. Although villanelles often do use meter, they don't have to use any one type of meter in particular. Let's now look at an example. I have lost my turtle dove. Isn't that her gentle coo? I will go and find my love. Hear you mourn your mated love. Oh God, I am mourning too. I have lost my turtle dove. The third form on the list is limerick. It is a humorous poem. It consists of 5 lines where the first, second, and third lines must have 7 to 10 syllables that rhyme and it has same rhythm. A limerick is a 5-line poem that consists of a single stanza, an AA-BBA rhyme scheme, and whose subject is a short, pithy tale or description. Most limericks are comedic, some are downright crude, and nearly all the trivial in nature. Edward Lear, a famous British poet and writer of literary nonsense, is widely considered the father of limerick. He didn't write the first limerick. The first limericks came about in the early 1700s and are often preserved in folk songs, but he popularized the form. More importantly, he wrote some of the best. His limericks often considered of a story about an old man. There was an old man with beard, who said, "It is just I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren, have all built their nest in my beard." The last form is the sonnet. The sonnet is a fixed verse containing 14 lines, a iambic pentameter. A sonnet has 2 variations, Shakespearean or Petrarchan, which differ notably in terms of form and subject. A sonnet is 1 stanza, 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter. The sonnet is derived from the Italian word sonetto, meaning a little sound or song, is a popular classical form, has compelled poets for centuries. The most common and simplest type is known as the English or Shakespearean sonnet, but there are several other types. The original form of the sonnet was the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, in which 14 lines are arranged in an octet, rhyming ABBA, ABBA, and a sestet rhyming either CDE, CDE, or CD, CD, CD. The English or Shakespearean sonnet came later, and as noted, is made of 3 quatrains rhyming AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, and closing rhyme heroic couplet GG. The Spenserian sonnet is a variation developed by Edmund Spenser, in which the quatrains are linked by their rhyme scheme AB, AB, BC, BC, CD, CD, EE. The Shakespearean sonnet. It is also known as English sonnet. It has 14 lines divided into 3, 4 lines and quatrains, and the final 2 lines or couplet. The most well-known and important sonnets in English language were written by Shakespeare. These sonnets cover such themes as love, jealousy, beauty, infidelity, the passage time, and death. The first 126 sonnets are addressed to a young man, while the last 28 are addressed to a woman. The sonnets are constructed with 3 quatrains and 1 couplet in the meter of iambic pentameter. By the third couplet, the sonnets usually take a turn and the poet comes to some kind of epiphany or teaches the reader a lesson of some sort. Of the 154 sonnets Shakespeare wrote, a few stand out. The Petrarchan sonnet. It has 14 lines of iambic meter. It is divided into two, the first 8 line and the final 6 line. The Petrarchan sonnet is named after the Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, a lyrical poet of 14th century Italy. Petrarch did not invent the poetic form that bears his name. The Italian sonnet of Dante sometimes backed the traditional Petrarchan rhyme scheme. Dante was fond of terza rima technique, which consists of interlocking 3-line rhymes. This followed the scheme ABA, BCB, CDC, D. What is the difference between Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet? The primary difference between a Shakespearean sonnet and a Petrarchan sonnet is the way the poem's 14 lines are grouped. The Petrarchan sonnet divides its lines between an octave, 8 lines, and a sestet, 6 lines.
Free verse, let us define the free verse, is a direct translation of the French phrase vers libre, which describes a specific movement in French poetry in the late 1800s. The declared objective of the movement is to release poetry from bondage of the strict conventions of rhythm and rhyme. The free verse poetry has no rules around rhyming, syllable count, or number of lines, and free verse allows the poet to express the ideas and emotions, and to shape poem however they would like. Remember, free verse can be short or long, and any topic because they have no rules. In free verse, the unit of rhythmic control is the rise and fall within the entire poem rather than the metric line or stanza. Characteristics of free verse. Now let us define the different characteristics of free verse. Enjambment. It derives from the French word means to step or put legs across. It can be defined as a thought or sense, phrase, or clause in a line of poetry that does not come to an end at the line break, but moves over to the next line. The opposite of enjambment is end stop, when a line in a poem ends with a period, comma, or other punctuation. It refers to the refusal to follow the usual rules of lineation and the thoughts and ideas being developed by the poetry naturally spills over or runs on from one line to the next without a major pause or syntactical break and do not typically have a punctuation mark. Allow the poet to let his or her ideas flow freely and more rhythmically. Lineation, it denotes the length of the poetic lines in relation to the line breaks, and it helps determine the silhouette or shape of the poem. The lineation is how lines are divided and where they end in relation to a clause or thought. Having a line breaks at the end of phrase or complete thought is a regular and expected pattern in poetry. Using this kind of technique is called enjambment, and it breaks our expectations of where a line should end. There are two lines of lineation in poetry, the long lines and the short lines. The long lines, it produces a poem that has thick shape. Short lines, it produces a poem that has a thin silhouette. The experimental text, which is the typography. The typography is the art of arranging letters and text in a way that makes the copy legible, clear, and visually appealing to the reader. It involves font style, appearance, and structure, which aims to elicit certain emotions and convey specific messages. The non-conventional forms of poetry, which is prose poetry poems, is a variation of free verse and embodies the contemporary poet's yearning for a more flexible medium of expression. It is hybrid literary form since it utilizes elements and attributes that are associated with both prose and poetry. The prose poetry shares with prose the characteristics of being written in sentence and paragraphs. In short,
Prose poetry is the poetry is not composed in verse but contains other poetic qualities like rhythm, figures of speech, voice, and tone, as well as mood and atmosphere. Now, let us define the concrete poetry. It's a form of poetry that deploys visual and typographical effect like the shape of words, letters, or symbols as they appear on the page as image. In addition to, or instead of the usual stanza divisions, and also known as shape, verse, visual poetry, and pattern poetry. The performance poetry is a postmodern art form, a hybrid genre that combines literary and dramatic elements. Performance poetry as a literary cum dramatic movement is also known as spoken word poetry. The important thing to remember is the actual face-to-face encounter between the poet performer and his/her audience, and the reactions evoked with one another and the resulting immediate community building, which does not occur in traditional print-based poetry.
Hi, I am teacher JP, and I am here to discuss the techniques and literary devices. Literary techniques are specific, deliberate constructions of language which an author uses to convey meaning. An author's use of a literary technique usually occurs with a single word or phrase, or a particular group of words or phrases, at one single point in a text. These devices serve a wide range of purposes in literature. Some might work on an intellectual level, while others have a more emotional effect. They may also work subtly to improve the flow and pacing of your writing. No matter what, if you're looking to inject something special into your prose, literary devices are a great place to start. Of course, for readers, literary devices can be difficult to identify, but here's a good rule of thumb. If you're reading a book and you find the author using language or narrative structure in an unusual way, there's probably a literary device at work. Indeed, some devices show up so frequently, you may not even register them as you're reading. The style of writing poetry differs from person to person. Long or short meters, 3 or 4 lines to a stanza. But the great thing is, no matter how a poem is written, it still holds great emotion. Some common techniques and literary devices used in poetry are onomatopoeia, alliteration, assonance, rhyming, simile, and metaphor. First is onomatopoeia. It refers to a word that sounds like what it refers to. The combination of letter sounds in the word imitate the natural sound of that object or action. Next is alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words or stressed syllables. Alliteration is the conspicuous repetition of identical initial consonant sounds in successive or closely associated syllables within a group of words, even those spelled differently. As a method of linking words for effect, alliteration is also called head rhyme or initial rhyme. Let's proceed to assonance. Assonance is a resemblance in the sounds of words or syllables either between their vowels or between their consonants. In poetry, the repetition of the sound of a vowel or diphthong in non-rhyming stressed syllables near enough to each other for the echo to be discernible. Rhyming. Correspondence of two or more words with similar sounding final syllables plays so as to echo one another. Rhyme is used by poets and occasionally by prose writers to produce sounds appealing to the reader's senses and to unify and establish a poem's stanzaic form. Next is simile. The subject of the poem is described by comparing it to another object or subject, using as or like. And lastly, metaphors. It is used in poetry to explain and elucidate emotions, feelings, relationships, other elements that could not describe in ordinary language.